Nebraska in Dawes County. My parents lived on a ranch. My father had homesteaded late in the last century. The home place was some 4 miles away from the little town of Marsland. My father had gone on to assemble a sizable ranch in the area over the several years, buying out the neighbors who had become discouraged and wanted to move to Colorado or California. I was taught at home, since we lived too far from school. At that time there were no automobiles. As a matter of fact, I did not see my first automobile until I was about 10 years old. This home teaching had been quite effective. Mother had been a school teacher before my parents were married. My earlier years in school were spent in the grade school at Marsland. I lived with an aunt so that I would be within walking distance of the school. I was the first in a great many years to go on to high school. This was in Crawford, Nebraska, where I boarded with some friends of my parents. I went to Crawford at the beginning of the week and returned home on the weekends, traveling by train. Our high school class consisted of 8 students. Incidentally, I was a member of the first football team that was organized at Crawford High School. I am not sure that any of the team had ever seen a football game by the time we played our first game. The summer after I finished high school, I took coursework at Chadron State Teachers College, preparing for a teacher's certificate. In the following year, I taught a country school with grades kindergarten through 8. This was about 6 miles from my home, and I rode horseback back and forth. With what I had saved from my salary as a teacher, it was time to go to the university. With a ranch background, and with the advice of my parents and others, I decided to enroll in the Ag College. One year there, I roomed with George Beadle, who went on in genetics to win a Nobel Prize. In the second year, I decided to go into pre-medical work. At that time, 2 years was required for admission to the graduate college, but since I did not have all of the required courses, I spent a 3rd year at the university at Lincoln. Principal among my informal advisors at that time were Roscoe Abbott in chemistry and T.J. Thompson in biochemistry. The advice of these people was a large factor in this decision. My selection to the class was rather different than the present patterns. I had talked to the pre-medical advisor, Dr. Barker, and filled out the application, furnished transcripts, and so forth. A short time later, he came to my desk in zoology lab and told me that I had been appointed to the class. At that time, I had not been on the medical campus or had any interviews with an admissions committee or taken any examinations. The freshman class was 100. It was generally understood that the class would be 75 going into the sophomore year, and it was. Our leadoff teachers were Dr. Latta, teaching embryology, and John T. Myers in bacteriology. The class was reduced appreciably by the time those courses had been finished and gross anatomy under Dr. Pointer, which followed. Toward the end of the first year was my first experience with pre-medical day. Pre-medical day at that time was a quite high point, and one of the featured exercises was the surgical demonstration. The surgical amphitheater at that time was on the top floor of Unit 1 of the University Hospital, with a door leading out to the roof from the observers' seats in that amphitheater. The interns worked hard to have a good case ready for this surgical demonstration, which was usually a leg amputation. These were people who had circulatory difficulty and gangrene of toes and so forth. The surgeon was generally John E. Summers, who operated in Civil War style using a long knife about 16 inches long. A few spurts of arterial blood were to be expected, and since the amphitheater had been conditioned ahead of time by some of the senior students liberally sprinkling ether about, there was a rush to the roof for fresh air at about that point. The sophomore year for me was notable primarily for biochemistry under Dr. Morgulis. Physiology was taught by Otis Cope, usually known as Skippy, and Dr. Gunther taught pharmacology. Dr. Eggers taught pathology through a major part of that year. He had a habit of walking back and forth across the front of the lecture room. In the class ahead of me were two men who knew shorthand. One sat on either side of the room and took down all of the lectures in shorthand, which were then printed up and had a really very good sale. Such commercialism was not looked on with much favor at that point. Dr. Morgulis had special experiments toward the end of the year for a few favored students. I did one of these studies, which he seemed to like very much. He asked me to spend the next year as a graduate student. This was done in several departments at that time, with the students taking a year out to earn a master's degree. I was anxious, however, to consider the medical course and declined his invitation. Morgie wouldn't speak to me for several years after that. During the junior year, we had hospital clerkships. One of the high points for me was on the pediatric service, where one of my patients was a young girl who had diabetes. She received the first insulin that was made available to the university hospital. During the junior year, I think one of the high points was Dr. A.D. Dunn's conferences, which he held at his home. 8 or 10 students were invited, juniors and seniors, and along with a few doctors, spent an evening once a week or perhaps every other week discussing a paper which was generally prepared by one of the students. In the summer between my junior year and senior year, I spent the time in the office of Dr. R.L. Ivins in Crawford. He was a general practitioner with a very busy practice. This amounted to the preceptorship, which was instituted as a formal part of the medical course for a good many of the students a few years later. This was an interesting experience for me, with several points standing out. it was an opportunity to deliver a baby in the home, and Dr. Ivins was the contract surgeon for the Fort Robinson military post at that time. It was then a remount post for the cavalry, and they had a modest number of soldiers. They had their own hospital at that place, which we visited several times a week. The senior year at that time was filled with a considerable number of electives. There were required courses, especially exercises at the clinics, taking part in the several clinics that were held, and at that time they had what was called an out-call service. On this service, the students saw patients in their homes, and there were also a number of home deliveries with one of the faculty in attendance. This was usually Harley Anderson, who was a very dependable and capable teacher in this field. One of the high points here was a young girl with diphtheria whom I saw in about the area of the present airport. At that time I had an old high cab Dodge which enabled me to get around to see my out-call patients. In this particular instance, it was in the winter time. The neighbors were watching, and all came out to help me through the snowdrifts to get to the home of this child. Fortunately, the child recovered, and I think everybody was happy about the situation. One of the electives that I had during that year was a course in the history of medicine with Dr. A. J. Brown. Jim Donellan and I were the only students to elect this course, so it was arranged that we would meet evenings at Dr. Brown's home. I was quite intrigued with his ability to give a running translation of a number of his old Latin books by renowned names in early medical history. This friendship with Dr. Brown lasted over many years. During World War II, Dr. Brown was very proud of some so-called subcontracts which he held. He had a machine shop in his basement and was able to do really very skillful work with this. His World War work was to make a number of special and unusual tools which were needed by one of the formal subcontractors in Omaha. The items which they needed were not available on the market since they were in high demand at the time, and so he made a number of these particular items which helped this contractor to meet his obligations in turning out this special equipment. During that time also, I was doing some work with Ora J. Miller, who was clinical pathologist in the department for a time. In that period, the idea of focal infection was much in vogue. This was a concept that an infection in a tooth root or a nasal sinus or some such place kept infection going in some other part of the body. My work was to make cultures from teeth which were extracted from patients in the hospital, and then trying to establish abscesses, tooth abscesses in dogs, to see if they would subsequently develop infections like those which had been present in the patients from whom the teeth had been extracted. I had no success in any of this work, and this proved to be the case in other studies around the country also, so that the ideas of focal infection gradually wore away. With graduation coming up, I was married to Elizabeth McVeigh, whom I had been dating since our freshman year in Lincoln. As this is recorded, we are preparing to celebrate our golden wedding anniversary. My internship was at Peter Bent Brigham Hospital in Boston, primarily in medicine, followed with training in the Department of Pathology. Dr. Bert Wolbach was at that time the head of pathology at the Harvard Medical School and pathologist to the Peter Bent Brigham Hospital. Toward the end of my training time there, I received a letter from Dr. Pointer inviting me to join the faculty as a teacher in clinical pathology. I learned later that Dr. Eggers, the chairman of pathology, apparently had not been consulted, but after a short period of adjustment, our relationships were always most harmonious. He was happy with teaching general pathology course and with his research, while I looked after all of the hospital pathology and laboratory work and taught clinical pathology, mostly in the junior year, along with the clinical pathologic conferences for seniors and faculty at that time. There was then one medical technician in the hospital. This term has now become medical technologist. Helen Wyant was doing the technical work at that time. Most of the laboratory work was done by the interns, such as the blood count, urinalyses, and so forth. So bacteriology and chemistry were the principal things being done by the hospital laboratory. In the first year I was there, the pediatrics ward was closed down several times by outbreaks of diphtheria. The custom to that time had been to do nose and throat cultures on children admitted to the ward, and then if these proved to be positive, the patient was isolated. We reversed this procedure, isolating the incoming patient until the nose and throat cultures proved to be negative, when the patient could then be transferred to the general ward. This seemed to end the frequent epidemics that had closed the ward during this period. Helen Wyant had started to train young women as medical technicians or technologists. This was during hard times, since this was the latter part of the severe depression of the early 30s. As time went on, the teaching program became better organized, and additional students could be accepted on the one-to-one basis in relationship to the employed technologists in the laboratory. I remember that one of the early trainees who finished the 1 year on-the-job training program was not able to find a job and continued as a volunteer laboratory worker for the greater part of a year. At that time, practically none of the smaller hospitals had medical technologists in their laboratories. As laboratory work became more sophisticated, it became evident that hospitals needed to have this type of personnel on hand, and so the program has grown steadily. It was rather shortly accepted as an approved training program and eventually was designed to give academic credit for the time spent. During these hard times, the legislature was always rather critical of the large amount of money that the university hospital was spending. The majority of patients were referred from the various counties of the state, and these were all, for practical purposes, patients unable to pay for their hospital care. I remember at one point, Dr. Pointer, then dean, was meeting with the legislature and was asked if there wasn't some way in which he could reduce the amount of money that was being spent in caring for patients in the hospital. He responded, yes, they could put straw on the floor and probably reduce the expenditures to a degree. It was at about this time that the legislature passed a law that the counties must pay for the care of patients admitted from their county to the university hospital. The statement was that the county should pay 2/3 of the cost of hospital care, but not to exceed $4 per day. During this period, we worked out an arrangement primarily with Dr. Esley Kirk, who was in charge of the clinical clerk programs in the hospital, to coordinate the lecture and didactic work that was being given in clinical pathology and in the clinical lecture exercises. This worked very well for some parts of the program and was carried on for several years before it was decided that this coordination was too difficult to maintain. During much of this period through the 30s, I was assisted in the autopsy service by part-time student assistants. These young men were paid a very modest stipend to assist with the work in the autopsy service. I was quite pleased that several of these young men subsequently went on to become trained pathologists. The tenor of functioning about the medical college changed rather abruptly with the outbreak of the war. First, of course, a number of the faculty members joined the armed services, reducing the coverage of the wards, and all of us felt the pressure of having to do more work. Rather shortly, the medical program was put on a 3-year cycle. The general format of the educational program was not significantly changed at first, but simply vacations were eliminated so that we were working around the year. Rather shortly, the students were mostly in uniform. This led to some variations in the students' program. The Army instituted a Saturday drill program. We, of course, had representatives of the Army on the campus, and the students had to make their reports regularly. Those who were in the Navy program were not in uniform and had no drill. This led to a considerable amount of needling between the services. Shortly, a student selection pattern was instituted by the armed services, in which a representative of each of the schools met at intervals at a central location to review the applications of students whom the service was recommending or considering for admission to medical school. The selection committee would review all of these applications, and their function was to indicate which students were acceptable for admission to a medical school and which were not. We did not choose individual students for our particular schools, but these were assigned by the military in whatever fashion they chose. Due to this program, John Tupper was assigned to our school. Dr. Tupper later became Dean of the University of California Medical College at Davis. Rather recently, his school has been in the news very much because of the Bakke reverse discrimination case. At about this time, the department was approved to offer formal residency training in pathology. The first resident we had in the department was Frank Tanner. Frank later became a pioneer in full-time pathology service in Lincoln. The program grew gradually in acceptance and in the number of residents. It is a matter of real pride that two chairmen in the College of Medicine at this point are chairmen of pathology and of microbiology, respectively. The number of residents increased appreciably after the war. Many of the men who had been in service wished to take up specialty training in many fields, and the numbers in pathology increased as they did in many other programs. The war years brought about a number of changes. An early one, as mentioned earlier, was a 3-year program with only a few short breaks. This led to having 2 graduating classes in 1 calendar year. With the war over, however, the faculty decided to go back to the 4-year program. But with the pressures for more training and with much new information to be incorporated into the general instructional programs, the classes began to encroach on the summers, so that the total time spent by the majority of students was really more than the typical 4 9-month years. Somewhat more recently, under the pressure to provide more physicians, it was decided to return to the 3-year program. I think the problems of the 3-year program had been forgotten by the time it was tried again, only to find that it really wasn't the panacea that some thought, and has been recently abandoned, going back to a 4-year program again. With the war over, there was a return to a more normal schedule, but a very great deal of new information had been developed, and new and better techniques were available in most fields in medicine. Research had become very much more important, and was being emphasized in most fields. About 1948, Dr. Pointer retired, and Harold Luth was named dean. He had been in the Army for a considerable period during the war. He wanted a military-type organization on the campus. This caused a very great deal of unrest. One of his proposals, which affected me particularly, was an attempt to divide the pathology department into general pathology and clinical pathology. In the best interests of the college or the future of teaching and service in pathology. The tensions became quite high. By this time, I had a number of well-trained people in the department. I had been frozen in my faculty position during the war, and it seemed appropriate that I should do a stint in military service. My contacts were closest with the Air Force, and in discussions with them, I was offered a commission as lieutenant colonel in that service. I reported for duty in July of 1951. My assignment was to the training command in charge of pathology at Scott Air Force Base Hospital near St. Louis. I was also appointed to the staff of the command surgeon, Colonel McElnay. There were a considerable number of training bases about the country at that time. We made a number of trips to inspect the hospitals and the training programs. I covered many parts of the United States in that capacity. Less than a year later, Dr. Luth had resigned, and I was approached by Dr. Reuben Gustafson, then Chancellor, about an appointment as Dean. There was considerable discussion with the Air Force, since my normal appointment was for 2 years. They agreed that I could be released at the end of the year, and I returned to Nebraska in July of 1952 as Dean of the College of Medicine. There were a considerable number of problems facing the college at that time. One had to do with faculty composition. On the past several reviews by accrediting organizations, the college had been criticized very severely for not having full-time instructors in the clinical departments. As a matter of fact, there were only 2 full-time instructors on the campus at that time. One was Willis Brown in obstetrics and gynecology, and Dr. John Gedgood in pediatrics. Both of these men were supported by funds from the Maternal and Child Health Program, and each of them held relatively junior appointments in their departments. A second problem that faced the college at that time was an antiquated building for the clinical teaching. The most recent building had been completed in 1928. Both of the 2 units of the hospital had been built on the large ward plan with only 1 to 3 rooms for isolation of patients and for individual patient care when this was needed. A building committee was appointed and spent a great deal of time in considering the needs of the several departments, basic science as well as clinical, and the pattern of development that would be most appropriate for that campus. Dr. Lowell Dunn was chairman of that committee for the greater part of the period of its studies. Another facet of problem was the School of Nursing. It was apparent that this needed very considerable strengthening because the whole pattern of instruction in nursing was tending toward a broader and more comprehensive background training, as well as good training in nursing techniques at the bedside. In relation to clinical faculty development, a great deal of discussion was carried on with the faculty in this regard. There were a good many on the clinical faculty, all of whom were volunteer faculty members, who felt that the addition of full-time clinical faculty members was not necessary, and as a matter of fact probably not desirable if our intention was to educate practitioners of medicine who would go into the numerous communities of the state then needing additional physicians, and as well as around other parts of the country. With the pressures that had been placed on the faculty, however, it was decided that full-time instructors in internal medicine, in surgery, in pediatrics, and in obstetrics and gynecology must be recruited. Dr. Moody was chairman of the Department of Internal Medicine, Dr. Herbert Davis in surgery, Dr. Herman Yar in pediatrics, and Dr. Earl Sage in obstetrics. These men, and especially with the assistance of Dr. Leon McGugan, a plan was drawn up proposing that well-qualified men should be brought into these departments, one in each of the four departments, in an assistant chairman capacity, essentially, for at least a year, and if they were found to fit well into the faculty pattern, that they would then become the chairman of the several departments. Search committees were developed in each of the several departments, and they searched the country for capable men to fill these positions. The nominations which came in and were approved after discussion were Dr. Robert Grissom in internal medicine, Dr. Merle Musselman in surgery, Dr. Gordon Gibbs in pediatrics, and Dr. Lester Odell in obstetrics. These men were brought into the department, and after a year's experience, it was felt that they should become chairman of the departments. This worked out very well, with the exception of the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology. Dr. Lester Odell was relatively soon at odds with a great many people on the campus and decided that he would much prefer to go into private practice. So he resigned from the faculty and left the community. Dr. McGugan was appointed as an interim chairman, and an additional search was carried out. Dr. Roy Holly was selected as the next chairman of the department. He proved to be a very energetic and effective person in that position, strengthening his junior faculty and increasing the amount of research work that was done very considerably. A few years later, he was designated as a vice chancellor for research and moved to the Lincoln campus, resulting in Dr. McGugan's functioning as interim chairman once again. Another problem facing the campus was strengthening the School of Nursing. Irma Kyle had been named as the head of the School of Nursing at the retirement of the founder and long-time director of the School of Nursing. She had worked most energetically and against considerable odds, I must say, in trying to modify and update the teaching programs of the School of Nursing. There was also increasing pressure to increase the size of the School of Nursing, resulting in a decision to build a new building to house the School of Nursing and the classroom facilities needed for a more effective program. Ms. Kyle had considerable difficulty in bringing about the change in pattern of teaching. A number of the faculty members on that School of Nursing faculty had been there a long time. All had been trained in the old hospital type training program, and she labored against the resistance of this group to bring about a more academically oriented curriculum. I mentioned earlier that a building committee had been appointed to develop plans for improved facilities for the College of Medicine. After a great deal of study, a proposal was presented that a new university hospital be built on the east side of 42nd Street. This created quite a furor among the faculty. A very large number of the volunteer faculty particularly opposed this idea, feeling that the campus should remain on the west side of 42nd Street. A point which I sensed in the attitude of particularly volunteer faculty, that was never openly spoken, but I think was a very strong factor, was a fear that the strengthened faculty in the clinical departments, coupled with the new hospital facility, would be unwelcome competition to the practitioners of the city and to the affiliated hospitals. In any event, a decision was made to enlarge the buildings on the west side of 42nd Street. This plan was set up in several sections, and the first unit of new construction eventually got underway. Among all of the things that went on in these years of planning two or three side issues come to mind. Very early in my tenure in the dean's office, Senator Terry Carpenter asked to come to the campus to visit and see what was going on the medical campus. Terry Carpenter was a very long-time member of the Nebraska legislature, a very strong individualist who was not averse to debating any topic on either side and challenging practically any other member of the legislature. His background was that of an entrepreneur in Scottsbluff and Gearing. One of his early enterprises was developing a series of gasoline service stations and eventually a small refinery. His string of filling stations were known as Terrible Terry's stations, and I think he took some pride in trying to maintain that kind of a public image. Terry and his wife came to the campus, and we spent a long day going over all facets of the operation of the campus, reviewing the faculty and its composition, the budget, and how we arrived at the requests we were making of the legislature, and our methods of managing financial affairs particularly. I must say that from that time on, I felt that Terry was always favorable to the medical campus, and I think he had an appreciable understanding of the problems that we had and the needs that faced the campus in trying to develop a strong medical and related educational program. Another little side issue, in an earlier period when negotiations were underway for the Clarkson Hospital to build across the street, one of the problems was that the university owned one of the lots that would be included in the grounds of the Clarkson Hospital. This meant several, really many trips to Lincoln for discussions with the university people and once or twice with committees of the legislature. Al Gordon at that time was a leading member of the Board of Trustees of the Clarkson Hospital, and I made several trips to Lincoln with him. On one of these trips, we went out West Dodge Street, and beyond 90th was a very large cornfield. At the time we were doing this, I think the western edge of residential construction was 92nd Street, and the tract of land extended then on out to approximately 114th Street. He told me that this land also extended from Dodge on the north to Pacific Street on the south. He indicated that he had purchased this in the early days of the Depression, that is the early 1930s, for $135 an acre. It had been farmed continuously, and he said had always provided a return on his money. At that time, he was expecting to hold it and will it to his children. Some years later, his daughter having died, he apparently changed his mind and sold the tract, which subsequently became the Regency development. The price he received for this land was never announced, although when the interstate was designed, it cut across the western part of the tract, and the price was settled in court. He got a few dollars less than $4,000 an acre for the condemned land for the freeway. His friends were sort of kidding him that he couldn't even get $4,000 an acre for that amount of land. Back to the campus and some of the changes that had occurred there. When I first saw the campus in 1925, there was a large athletic field to the west of the hospital, which then consisted only of Unit Number 1. As a matter of fact, for several years there had been the medical relays held as one of the official track meets in which Nebraska and a number of adjacent states competed. There was also a baseball diamond used primarily by the students of the college. The remainder of that area extending on west was principally an alfalfa field. For a long time, some sheep were pastured in that area. During those years, sheep blood cells were extensively used in one of the laboratory tests that was very commonly undertaken. And so somebody from the pathology department had to go out every few days and draw some blood from the veins of one of the sheep. Eventually, with developments on the north side of Dewey Avenue, and with the building of the second unit of University Hospital, a road was built, still leaving high banks on either side. Then, in the 40s, an arrangement was worked out between Douglas County, the university, and the state of Nebraska for the combined operation of a psychiatric unit. Dr. Cecil Whitson had been brought in to head up this operation, which was housed in the Douglas County Hospital, some blocks south of the campus. This proved to be a very effective operation, and with the enlarging number of patients, the space pressure, as well as some disagreements among individuals involved at the county hospital, it was decided that there really should be a separate building to house the psychiatric unit. A space was set up on the western part of the campus, and with funds from several sources, Psychiatric Institute was developed. Dr. Whitson continued as director of this institute, which made a very considerable name for itself in the innovative management of psychiatric problems, the amount of research that was done in conjunction with it, and its relationships between the several counties of the state, the university, and the medical school. During the period of Dr. Pointer's deanship, discussions had gotten underway about building a children's hospital. After very extended discussions, land was made available west of the University Hospital for the building of the children's hospital. I am sure the affiliation never did develop with the closeness that Dr. Pointer had hoped. This hospital, children's hospital, had a separate board, and there was always a considerable distance in thinking between the university people and the Children's Hospital Board and the medical staff of Children's Hospital. Somewhat later, the J.P. Lord School was built on land fairly close by. The Lord School had first been housed in the field school at quite some distance from the university campus. Dr. Lord had been chairman of the orthopedic department at the university for a considerable time, and he was quite influential in working with the school board to develop a school where handicapped children could be in a school setting. In the field school, the ground floor level was developed so that these handicapped children could be taught in a school setting. With the increasing number of children, and it became apparent that a separate facility would be desirable. This was then built on the west side of 44th Street. There was a relatively close relationship between the school, the medical school, and Children's Hospital during this period. A subsequent development had to do with the Hattie B. Monroe home. The Hattie B. Monroe home had once been in the Benson area of Omaha and was a facility for the care of very severely handicapped children. With the passage of time, the composition of its patients changed considerably. Whereas osteomyelitis and poliomyelitis had been the chief causes of severe handicap for the children cared for at the Hattie B. Monroe home, this and with the severe cardiac conditions resulting from rheumatic fever all declined very considerably. There came a time when they felt that there should be a reconsideration of its mission. And in the course of these discussions, it was decided that a building adjacent to Children's Hospital and to the Lord School would be an appropriate modification. So the Children's Rehabilitation Institute was built at the corner of the medical campus. This facility has been working very closely with the university from the time of its move to that location. In the meantime, automobile transportation had increased tremendously, and so parking lots had to be built in a number of places, some adjacent to the Children's Hospital, and eventually the pressure became great enough that a separate parking garage was built on the east side of 42nd Street. During the period I was in the dean's office, discussions were opened with the M.A.L.S Foundation. Gene M.A.L.S had been a hotel man, operating the Fontanelle Hotel and at least two others in the city, as well as having hotels in several other locations. During the time I was in the dean's office, discussions got underway with the Board of Trustees of the M.A.L.S Foundation. Gene M.A.L.S had been a hotel man in Omaha for a good many years, operating the Fontanelle Hotel and at least two others. He also owned hotels in a number of other locations. Mr. M.A.L.S was a bachelor, and in his later years he became considerably handicapped and began to give some thought as to what should be done with his estate. Out of this came the decision to set up a foundation with a board of directors, mainly men who had been associated with him in the operation of this hotel empire. I thought the most understanding and most effective of the group was Jake Riefschneider. The estate was said to amount to something between $30 and $40 million, which at that time was a rather considerable sum of money. Allocations were made to a number of situations. One, a significant amount was put into the development of the Omaha airport, enough that M.A.L.S name was attached. The story goes that the University of Omaha had built a new building, and one day when Gene was riding with some of his associates, he saw this new building. He had been discussing some possibilities with Milo Bale, then president of the University of Omaha. And the story goes that as he saw this building, and in the next conversation with Milo Bale, some comment was made that with enough money to finish the building, they would be happy to have M.A.L.S name on the building. And Gene said, fine. So they immediately took out the stones that had had the previous building title on it, and it became the M.A.L.S Library building. Gene M.A.L.S also gave appreciable amounts of money to a school which he once attended. In the beginning of our discussions, the concept of the board had been a type of hospital building in which patients with cancer would be cared for. As our discussions continued, the point was raised that undoubtedly a great deal more could be done in behalf of many more patients potentially or actually suffering from cancer if this were to be a research institute with the work related in some reasonable fashion to a better understanding of cancer, methods of its prevention and control. After many discussions, this idea was accepted, and so the Epley Foundation provided a significant part of the construction costs of the building, which was built along the north edge of the medical campus and is known as the Epley Institute. Somewhat after this, the Central Administration of the University of Nebraska had decided on a pattern of asking administrative officers to retire from their administrative posts on reaching age 60. I think I was probably the first of the administrative types to approach that age, and in light of the general situation, it seemed appropriate that I should retire, which occurred in July of 1964. At this time, Cecil Whitson was named as Dean of the College of Medicine. At about this same time, significant amounts of federal funds became available for strengthening medical educational facilities. Dr. Whitson was in an unusually good position, in my estimation, to take advantage of this change in federal attitudes. I think a number of men in responsible positions in health education and welfare, which was administering these funds, had been acquaintances or good friends of his during his several years in naval service. He was then able to get information and to present his proposals much more effectively than probably anybody else available at the time. He was thus able to bring about the very striking development of the medical campus in the next several years. At the time I retired, I was given a sabbatical leave, but very shortly after my retirement, I was approached by the dean of the College of Medicine at the University of Illinois to undertake a year's time at least assisting with a development of a new medical school in the north part of Thailand. The University of Illinois had an agency for international development contract to provide a number of visiting faculty members to work with the new faculty in this medical school in Chiang Mai, Thailand. one of the people who had been on our faculty for quite some time was Charles Richards. Dr. Richards had been a student at the university in the up to the early part of the war, and had been in the Navy during the war. He had been associated with health, education, and welfare for some little time in Washington, and when the application from Thailand came in for consideration, he had been approached to go out and carry on the discussions in the early stages when they were trying to develop this affiliation. He worked with the Thai and American people involved in the design of the contract and what sort of things could be developed out there. When the University of Illinois then became the affiliating institution in the United States, and they heard of my availability, I think this led to their approach to me. I had also known Granville Bennett, the dean, for a great many years. He was also a pathologist and had been at the Brigham Hospital in Boston during the time I was in training there. At any rate, Mrs. Tollman and I went to Thailand and spent a year in Chiang Mai. I worked predominantly with the Department of Pathology, but also was one of the people working with the dean at intervals. This was really a most enjoyable experience. It was frustrating at times, since the Thais are quite deliberate. I had realized very early that the best way of working with the people in the department particularly was to discuss with them a variety of approaches to some of the problems that they recognized without making formal recommendations as to what their decisions should be. Obviously, I was probably more enthusiastic about certain options than others. At any rate, it would frequently be anywhere from 2 to perhaps 4 months when the chairman of the department would make an announcement of some changes that we had discussed that long before. After this, I came back to the department and participated in the teaching and some of the service work of the department. But rather shortly, Dr. Whitson approached me that he had some committee work that he would very much like to have me undertake. As a matter of fact, he had approached me before I returned to the campus about taking on the direction of the Military Service Association, which persisted for the next 2 or 3 years before that was phased out. At any rate, over the next few years, I became more and more involved in administrative activities. One of these, which I found really very rewarding, was working with the development of the affiliated educational programs. There had been developed the quite new program in physical therapy. And of course I had had many years of association with the medical technology program, but at any rate, medical technology, radiologic technology, physical therapy, eventually inhalation therapy, and then physician's assistant programs were all associated in this division which I was supervising. One other interlude, really two interludes, that were most interesting to me were trips to a new medical school in Erzurum, Turkey. These came about because the University of Nebraska had an agency for international development assistance to this new Ataturk University in Erzurum in the development of their College of Agriculture. They had apparently been very effective in this relationship. The university then set about developing a new medical school. The medical schools at that time had been in either Ankara, the capital, or in Istanbul. A related story I thought rather interesting. There was a medical school in Ankara, Turkey, which had been developed with the assistance of German teachers and advisors. Turkey had been an ally of Germany in the First World War, and the Germans had been very helpful in developing a number of their institutions. However, as time went on, many of the younger Turks were trained either in England or France or particularly in the United States. These younger members were not particularly enthusiastic about the German pattern of instruction. Somewhat related, one young Turkish physician with, I gather, very good relationships with the ruling members of the country had decided to develop a children's hospital in Ankara. This had been built with funds from some of the foundations in the United States, particularly the Rockefeller Fund, I am told, plus appreciable support from governmental agencies and private agencies in Turkey. The building had been almost completed when it was gutted by fire. The story is that this man then got on the telephone, and before the embers were cool, he had lined up enough money to rebuild this children's hospital, which was carried out. As time went on, these younger and Western-oriented physicians decided that they really needed a medical school. As a first move in their development, however, they built a nursing school fairly close by, and then went on to the development of the medical school in Ankara with the Western orientation. When the government decided on developing a new medical school in the far eastern end of the country at Erzurum. This medical school in Ankara was approached to provide some assistance in faculty members to get the new school started. The story is that this man who had been managing the medical school simply checked off 50 names of faculty members in all of the various departments and told them they were to go out and help get this new medical school started, each of them to stay a minimum of 3 years and possibly longer, and this was done. As the new medical school was being built in Erzurum, these faculty members decided that some assistance in some of their planning, and particularly in equipment and in library support, would be helpful. They approached the Americans there for the Agricultural College, and they in turn got in touch with the University of Nebraska, and out of that I was approached to go out and spend 2 relatively short periods of advising those people as to equipment, library, etc. This was certainly a gung-ho group. They were most enthusiastic, feeling that they were professionally competent. They did not want advisors in the medical fields, but they did want assistance on these related facets of the development of the medical school. One of the points of great pride of the university at Erzurum was their very large campus. They insisted that it was the largest campus in the world, and I have no reason to doubt it, because this campus was a tract estimated at something like 10 miles by 20 miles. It crossed the valley along which Erzurum is built, and so includes most every kind of landscape that the people in the eastern part of the country might encounter. And they were certainly an enthusiastic and I felt very competent group. So then, back to the campus. Along about this time, I was reaching the end of the customary period of possible annual reappointment. I had become very considerably involved in the development of teaching aids in the department after I moved out of the administrative activities. So I spent part-time with the department for a couple of years in developing more of their teaching aids. Then reached retirement. We had decided quite some time earlier, my wife and I, that we would like to move to Tucson. There were a couple of things pushing us in that direction. One, the winters no longer appealed to us very strongly, and we had visited Tucson a number of times. Mrs. Tollman's sister had been living in Tucson for a number of years. She had married Dr. Francis Bean, who was assistant superintendent of University Hospital during the latter part of my term as a medical student. He had then gone on to Vermont and later to Tucson as hospital superintendent. And so we had visited winter times, particularly here on a number of occasions. My older son Dan had become so enamored with the Tucson area that he attended the University of Arizona, from which he was graduated. At any rate, we then moved to Tucson and have spent a very pleasant several years here as this account is prepared. Well, Don came down here to medical school, and my guess is that he graduated in the middle to late 30s. He's a surgeon in Tucson, and I see him relatively frequently because I've been going to a particular conference at Tucson Medical Center, which he attends with fair regularity.
Is there a Dr. Jansen there?
Yes, I see Dr. Jansen from time to time.
I always remember him because there's two S's in his name.
Yes. I can't now get this surgeon's name, but he's made himself a good reputation in Tucson.
Okay.
And I see him quite occasionally. Oh, the head of orthopedic surgery at the medical school is Professor Peltier's son. Peltier was head of microbiology or bacteriology, as they may have called it, on the Lincoln campus back in years ago. His son was not a graduate of this school. I've forgotten where he went, not to the University of Nebraska. I see Dr. Sorensen of the nursing college there occasionally.
Oh, yes.
I think she was here for some kind of a dedication a year or two ago.
She was.
Gladys Sorensen.
Well, wasn't she here when they dedicated the new College of Nursing?
That's probably the time I'm thinking of.
Yeah. Well, the young Carr boy that graduated last, I say young because there's 7 or 8 of them, you know, graduated last June, is training, I believe, at Tucson, orthopedics.
I hadn't encountered him. I guess I hadn't known he was in the city.
It would be only since last July, probably.
July.
It just seemed to me, yes, because Mrs. Carr, this is Bill Carr's son. Bev Carr was so happy that he was able to go there, and I think Neil Vanslow helped a little bit to get him started there. We have an exhibit downstairs of the Carr family. What is it? 210 years of medical practice. When you add up all of it. Yeah.
Wasn't that in the alumni bulletin?
Yes,
yes, I saw that some months ago.
Yes, we did this in June so that we could get all the people together. And his uncle, no, it would be Bill's uncle, is going to be here, who was in your class.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. He's going to be here for the reunion. I saw his name on the list.
Yeah.
Well, I just wondered if you had any inclination or interest in talking to some of these people at some time. I'd be glad to furnish tapes.
Yeah, I can see what I can do on that. I can probably
Sure.
scrounge a little time with one or another of them from time to time.
Well, I think it would be helpful. We've got committees all over the place for the centennial celebration, you know, and hoping to get a lot of information that will make the publications that might come out a little more interesting than just somebody sitting down and saying this happened, that happened, and on June 12th, X number of people graduated and things like that. Little personal things that will make this much more interesting.
They aware that there were once on this campus the name stones of the Omaha Medical College. I don't know whether they still exist or not.
They do. They do.
Okay.
This see changes on the campus since you left?
Yes, very great deal.
Yeah.
Because the developments across 42nd Street have happened. The ambulatorium is new. And of course that has led to a great many internal shifts. So that occasionally I see something familiar. And that's only 5 years ago.
Yes, yes. And then the development over here by Clarkson.
Yes. Yes.
That was a surprise, wasn't it, when you tried to come up 44th Street, or aren't you driving?
Yes, I am driving.
Yeah. And,
but although I had seen some little note about that office building and parking area going up over there. Sounds as if the medical facilities are all being concentrated in here in a relatively few blocks. Although as we went by, I noticed that Bergen Mercy had a big addition, which I understand is offices, outpatient, etc., which was
I'm not sure.
all new.
Yes, that's new, and of course their extended care.
Yes.
Get out there too. And have you been by Methodist Hospital? You see the children's
Yes, enough
hospital?
to see the skeleton of the building that's going up. And I was also read an account somewhere, some piece of paper that crossed my desk in Tucson, that they have decreed that Omaha has too many hospital beds.
Yes, we're over-bedded.
Yes. Well, of course, that has been developing for close to 20 years, I guess.
Yes.
Because that was the beginning of the conversation about how many hospital beds are appropriate for a certain size community. And immediately, I think all of the hospital boards in Omaha got very busy, because it was clear that at some time somebody was going to say, this is the number.
Yeah.
And so the new units all had to be built very quickly.
Before they were cut off.
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, I was seeing another thing. This is to a degree unrelated. About the Regency area development.
Yes.
Did I put that in my tape or not?
Oh, you did. You told about going to
Lincoln.
with A.W. Gordon.
Yes.
Yes.
So, well, we happened to drive around that today. Brought it fresh to mind again.
Yes.
Because all that office area development is new since we were here.
Well, yes, because some of it's just gone up in the last year. That new Shepler's building.
Yes.
And now they are going to build a Marriott hotel out there, 300 rooms or something like that. And I heard that the Mormon Church was going to build a building out there, at least in that area. Now, whether it's this side of Dodge or the north side, I don't know. That was passed on to me, sort of a rumor. I don't know whether it's true or not. But